the Duchess of Duplicity is out of control.
Meghan gave them 2 hours. 2 hours of photos and mingling. Then she left.
Meghan Markle's $3,000 a head women's retreat in Sydney has failed to sell out.
Meghan Markle's women's retreat has officially wrapped, and let's just say it was not at all what people were expecting. The event, promoted as an exclusive luxury weekend experience with Meghan herself, promised attendees something intimate, immersive, and personal.
The women who remortgaged their enthusiasm to spend a weekend with the Duchess of Sussex were left at the Intercontinental to enjoy a Duchess-free evening.
Women reportedly paid up to around 3,200 Australian dollars to attend what was described as a once-in-a-lifetime retreat, a full weekend of wellness, connection, and direct interaction with the Duchess of Sussex. But according to what actually happened on the ground, the reality looked very different.
She is coining it in from these last few days in Australia. I can't understand the people who have paid $3,000 to listen to a waffle, a load of word salad, and then get some photos.
Meghan Markle made what can only be described as a brief appearance, lasting just about 2 hours. 2 hours of conversation, photos, and a Q&A session. And then she was gone. For many attendees, that became the central talking point. Because this wasn't marketed as a quick meet and greet, it was sold as a full weekend experience with Meghan as the headline figure.
2 hours of photos and mingling. Then she left and drove to Alliance Stadium with Harry and was photographed in the stands sipping wine while 300 women sat in a hotel conference room in Coogee wondering where their Duchess went.
Instead, reports and attendee reactions suggest that once her segment was over, she left the venue entirely. And where did she go? Straight to a rugby match with Prince Harry.
To the surprise of absolutely no one, she made it all about herself.
Photos and reports indicate that shortly after her appearance at the retreat, Meghan was seen attending a New South Wales Waratahs game, sitting alongside Harry in the stands. So while hundreds of women remained at a luxury hotel in Sydney, continuing the so-called wellness weekend without her, the main figure they had paid to see had already moved on to a completely different public engagement. That contrast is exactly what started fueling online discussion. Because when you break it down, the structure of the event raises a simple question. What were people actually paying for?
This woman is desperate for money and is prepared to do pretty much anything to get it. I mean, this is the last resort of the D-list celebrity.
Was it a full immersive retreat with Meghan Markle at the center? Or was it essentially a scheduled appearance, packaged and marketed as something much larger? Some attendees described strict security procedures upon arrival, with heavy screening before entering the venue.
Women paid up to 3,200 Australian dollars for the experience. They flew from around the world. They were physically patted down by security just to walk through the hotel door? What?
Others pointed out that the expectations set by the event branding didn't seem to match the reality of Meghan's limited presence. The promise was a weekend experience, but the headline moment was over in under 2 hours, and that's where the criticism begins to build. Because for many, it doesn't just feel like a scheduling issue. It feels like a mismatch between marketing and delivery. A luxury wellness retreat built around one of the most recognizable women in the world, where that same woman appears briefly, speaks, poses for photos, and then exits before the weekend even properly begins. So full weekend retreat, but Meghan only appears briefly?
They stayed in this place, right? $4,500 a night. And by the way, they're on a humanitarian trip. They're keeping it real. Harry and Meghan, super down to earth, staying in an accommodation which costs nearly $5,000 a night.
Meanwhile, the rest of the program, yoga sessions, workshops, group activities, continued without her presence. A full itinerary built around transformation and connection, but noticeably missing the one person many attendees had come to see. And that contrast between expectation and reality is what has turned a simple wellness event into a much louder conversation online. Now it looks like just a huge PR moment, because whether you view it as a carefully structured appearance, a branding moment, or a misunderstood retreat format, one thing is clear. The experience many women paid thousands for did not match the image that was sold to them.
Why are you going to pay thousands of dollars if you're down there in Australia or if you're traveling to listen to someone whose businesses have all crashed and burned? You're going to take a life and career advice from a woman who everything she touches turns to crap.
The security around the retreat immediately became one of the most talked about details, and not in a subtle way. According to attendee accounts and podcast commentary, the level of security felt unusually intense for what was marketed as a wellness-style weekend event. Guests reportedly went through strict checks upon arrival, with some even describing full pat-down searches before being allowed into the venue. The process was not just a quick ticket scan or identity check. It felt more like airport-level screening for a private hotel retreat. And that's where the question naturally comes in. Why did it need to be this intense?
Security was so intense that attendees were physically searched before being allowed into the venue. Photos from the entrance show women standing with their arms extended while security personnel ran hands over their clothing.
For an event held inside a booked luxury hotel, some attendees reportedly felt surprised by how tightly controlled access was. There were descriptions of women standing with their arms out while security personnel physically checked them before entry. For some, it created a strange contrast, a wellness retreat designed around relaxation, mindfulness, and connection, but filtered through a highly controlled and heavily secured entry process. This naturally led to discussion online about the scale of security surrounding Meghan Markle.
For a wellness retreat at a beach hotel in Koji, because apparently inner peace requires a full body pat down.
Some questioned whether such a level of protection was necessary for a two-day wellness gathering, while others pointed out that given her global profile, high security is simply part of her public life now. Still, for attendees on the ground, the experience reportedly felt more restrictive than expected for a women's retreat centered around openness and healing.
Can't get on television anymore, so they start selling themselves. It's classic. They start selling access to themselves.
Inside the event, Meghan's segment focused on what she described as real woman-to-woman conversations, an attempt to create an intimate and authentic dialogue with the audience. The idea, at least in presentation, was to strip away distance and formality and instead engage in direct, honest conversation about life, pressure, and personal experience. However, the reality of that moment was tightly structured. Her appearance lasted roughly 2 hours, a combination of a Q&A session, brief interaction, and photo moments.
At this wellness summit, Marcus Anderson was he's Harry's sort of shadowy figure, best friend in the background.
At the retreat, another unexpected figure reportedly arrived alongside Meghan Markle, Marcus Anderson. And yes, you heard that right. Marcus Anderson, a name often described as Harry's shadow figure, as Meghan's second husband, because his appearance in all of their most important events is very questionable. So the person described as part of the inner orbit around Harry and Meghan's world was present at this event too.
Apparently, when Harry walked into the room, there was lots of gushing about how handsome Harry is and all this rubbish. And then Harry apparently looked very uncomfortable when Meghan started speaking about Marcus and ran out the room and left and didn't stay. Now, I think that's very strange.
He is widely known within elite social circles connected to Soho House culture, a private members network deeply embedded in entertainment, fashion, and celebrity industries. Within that space, Anderson is often portrayed as one of the key behind-the-scenes figures, someone who moves comfortably across high-profile social environments and is frequently linked to introductions and connections within that ecosystem.
And I think it's to do with the Soho House chain down in Australia, sort of testing the waters for that.
Right.
And it's interesting that Meghan wants Marcus there with her on this excursion down under.
Over time, he has been described as part of the wider background network around Prince Harry and Meghan, a figure who appears at various moments where their personal, social, and professional worlds intersect. Their wedding, Babushowi, everywhere, he was there. Because of that consistency, his presence at yet another high-profile appearance naturally drew attention and discussion. What made this particular moment stand out even more were the reactions and stories surrounding the interaction inside the event itself.
Isn't he known as Meghan's second husband?
He is. And he attended this wellness event with Meghan.
During the Q&A segment featuring Meghan, there were claims about a visibly charged atmosphere when the conversation shifted toward personal relationships and the people within their close circle. At one point, it was suggested that Prince Harry appeared uncomfortable during parts of the discussion. Some accounts describe him as reacting noticeably to the tone of the conversation, with speculation that he briefly stepped away from the room before returning later. The interpretation among observers was that certain topics being discussed felt too personal or too close to internal dynamics that are usually kept out of public settings.
Multiple people spotted Marcus Anderson Meghan's longtime friend and personal fixer lurking nearby, which tells you everything about whether this was a spontaneous act of compassion or a scheduled content opportunity.
Whether taken as simple misreading of the moment or something more symbolic, the situation quickly became part of the wider narrative surrounding the event. The presence of Marcus Anderson, combined with the emotional tone of the conversation and Harry's reported reaction, created a moment that some interpreted as revealing more about the inner circle dynamic than intended. In that context, Anderson's attendance becomes more than just a guest appearance. It feeds into a broader perception that the same group of individuals continues to appear around Meghan and Harry in different settings, social, private, and professional, reinforcing the idea of a tightly connected inner network that moves with them across various public appearances.
There are reports that someone in the sausages camp tipped off Channel 9 about their location in advance, so the cameras would already be rolling when they arrived. This sounds like Meghan.
And that is exactly why this moment stood out, not because of a single conversation or reaction, but because of how familiar faces keep reappearing in key environments, shaping the atmosphere around some of their most high-profile public engagements. And this is where another question starts to emerge. Was this really a women's space as it was originally presented?
2 hours. And then she left with Harry, who, by the way, showed up at a women-only event, which drew its own wave of criticism.
Because while the retreat was marketed around female empowerment, wellness, and intimate conversations, the actual setting included the presence of Prince Harry, which immediately shifted how some people interpreted the atmosphere of the event. Online commentary quickly picked up on this detail. Some questioned why Harry was present at a women-focused gathering in the first place, especially one that was framed around shared female experiences and open conversation between women.
If I wanted to attend a women-only event, I wouldn't be happy to see a man present, and I wouldn't care who his father is. Although if you see Harry in this posture, you see that the women-only thing, I don't know, I'm not going to elaborate.
His appearance alongside Meghan Markle sparked debate about whether the original concept of a women-only environment was still fully intact, or whether the event had evolved into something broader and more public-facing. From that perspective, the presence of a high-profile male figure, particularly one as globally recognizable as Harry, changed the dynamic in the eyes of some observers.
Meghan wearing pantyhose in Australia after publicly complaining that being forced to wear them as a royal felt inauthentic.
What was supposed to feel like an intimate, women-centered retreat instead began to look more like a highly managed celebrity appearance, where boundaries between private discussion and public spectacle became less clear. And that contrast is exactly what fueled further discussion. This is where the wider cultural framing around Meghan Markle starts to become just as important as the retreat itself, because the reactions are no longer only about one event, but about a pattern people think they recognize. One of the strongest comparisons that keeps appearing in public discourse is with Diana, Princess of Wales. Diana is often remembered as someone who expressed vulnerability in a very human, immediate way, without needing structured branding, staged events, or repeated media formats.
You became a large public figure. Every public figure has been subjected to negative scrutiny, often very intense and unpleasant. You had the benefit of universally loving and adoring, praise-fawning press for a year.
That contrast is now frequently used as a reference point when people interpret Meghan's public storytelling. The difference is not necessarily about truth or intention, but about perception. Diana's narrative is seen as organic and unplanned, while Meghan's is often viewed through the lens of media production, interviews, and curated appearances. This comparison shapes how audiences interpret every emotional statement Meghan makes today, including those about being attacked or misunderstood. Another reference point that often comes up is the idea of the Fyre Festival. While the scale and nature are completely different, the comparison is not about identical events. It is about expectation versus delivery.
And the sausages decided that their publicity tour would not be complete without a visit to the memorial.
Fyre Festival became a cultural symbol of overpromised luxury and underdelivered experience. In the case of celebrity-driven wellness events like this retreat, critics draw parallels in structure, high pricing, strong branding, aspirational messaging, and then a reality that feels more limited or fragmented than the marketing suggested. Even when the experiences are not comparable in seriousness, the psychological pattern people reference is similar, a gap between the image sold and the product experienced. From there, the discussion often shifts into what can be described as the victim narrative interpretation.
My life advice, call me crazy, if you marry a prince and you make it into the royal family, just sit your ass there and eat crumpets and scones, okay? Don't blow it, okay?
Some observers believe Meghan consciously shapes her public identity around being a misunderstood, unfairly targeted, and emotionally affected public figure. In this reading, the repeated emphasis on long-term scrutiny and emotional hardship becomes part of a consistent brand identity. This narrative is powerful because it triggers a natural audience response. People tend to empathize with perceived vulnerability, especially when it is framed as resilience after sustained pressure. In that sense, the narrative can strengthen emotional connection, increase relatability, and reinforce public support. However, there is a completely different interpretation that does not assume strategy at all. From this perspective, it is not branding. It is a trauma loop.
Meghan is like, oh, was this Catherine's pillow? I'd like to have Catherine's pillow and maybe soak up some of her royal DNA so I can be a verified royal myself.
The idea here is that repeated references to past experiences are not calculated messaging, but an ongoing processing of lived reality. In this view, the repetition of certain themes is simply what happens when a person continues to publicly reflect on experiences that still feel unresolved. It is not about controlling perception, but about not having fully moved past the impact of those events. Then, there is a third layer, which sits between the two extremes: strategic positioning. In this framing, Meghan's public identity is built around consistent themes: resilience, healing, women's empowerment, and overcoming adversity. These are not random topics. They form a coherent narrative structure that appears across interviews, speeches, and public appearances. Within that structure, phrases like, "They tried to destroy me," become symbolic anchors, shorthand for a larger story of survival and reinvention. The reason this becomes controversial is not the message itself, but the repetition. For critics, the issue is pattern recognition.
Look at her strutting in, just so self-important, just the pomp and the circumstance. They're like, the Duchess of Sussex. And you would think she's, at Westminster Abbey.
When similar emotional framing appears in multiple contexts, from interviews to public speeches to events like the retreat, it can start to feel less like spontaneous reflection and more like a rehearsed narrative framework. Over time, that repetition changes audience perception. What may initially be received as openness and vulnerability can, for some viewers, begin to feel like a structured public script rather than a moment of raw expression. This tension between authenticity and narrative consistency is ultimately what drives most of the debate. It is not just about what is being said, but how often it is being said, in what contexts, and how it fits into the broader public image that has developed over time.
They will spend Saturday doing wellness activities with the speakers who have not been publicly confirmed. They are sharing hotel rooms with the strangers, and the highlight of their $3,200 experience lasted 120 minutes.
It was framed as a headline conversation, but in practice it functioned more like a scheduled stage appearance within a much larger program. And that disconnect is exactly what some people are now questioning. Because when you place a narrative of healing, openness, and emotional connection next to a short, highly controlled appearance inside a heavily secured environment, the contrast becomes hard to ignore.
So they stayed at the Royal Suite at the 5-star St. Regis, in a room described as the only one of its kind, located on the 15th floor of the 17-story hotel. The suite is said to include 3 fully equipped bathrooms, 3 bathrooms, which is nothing compared to the 16 bathrooms in their Montecito mansion.
It also feeds into a broader conversation around the modern wellness industry. Events like this sit in a space where celebrity influence, luxury branding, and personal development overlap. And when a figure like Meghan enters that space, her presence automatically elevates the scale and the expectations of what is being delivered. So the question that keeps coming up is simple. Is this really about healing and genuine connection, or has it become something else entirely?
This is all Meghan Markle ever wanted in life. Meghan Markle, she just wanted to be an influencer with a blog.
Because what's clear is that this is not just a small-scale wellness retreat anymore. It is a high-end, celebrity-driven experience operating inside a very specific commercial niche, one where access, image, and exclusivity carry just as much weight as the actual content of the program itself. And within that framework, every detail, from security procedures to the length of a conversation, becomes part of a much bigger perception.
Meghan turning the Bondi Beach Terror Memorial into a photo opportunity that Australians are calling disaster tourism.
There's also another detail that has started circulating around this retreat, the question of whether it was actually sold out. While the official messaging around the event suggested strong demand and a fully booked experience, multiple reports and discussions online indicate that the retreat may not have been completely sold out in the way it was presented. Yet Meghan Markle and the event branding still framed it as a highly in-demand, fully booked weekend.
She went from strutting down the aisle at her royal wedding to strutting onto the set, of MasterChef, a reality cooking show.
And that's where the question comes in. If tickets were still available or not fully filled, why present it as sold out? And more importantly, where is the line between marketing hype and reality in events like this? A separate detail that has also been discussed in media circles is a claim involving a journalist who says she was refunded her personal ticket to the retreat after organizers became aware of her profession. According to the report, the journalist had initially purchased access like any other attendee, but was later contacted and issued a refund, with her participation ultimately declined. The suggestion was that her role in media may have influenced the decision once it was identified.
Duke and Duchess of Dollar. Not sausages, I prefer sausages, but dollar fits. Because even the journalists who have covered this couple for a decade have stopped pretending that trips are about anything other than money.
There were many online discussions suggesting that not everyone who wanted to attend was actually accepted, with some people speculating that attendees may have been selectively chosen. If accurate, this adds another interesting layer to how the guest list may have been managed, not just in terms of availability, but potentially in terms of who was ultimately considered suitable for the environment surrounding Meghan Markle and the retreat's public image. Here's the missing layer that ties everything together, and it actually changes how the entire retreat narrative looks when you step back from individual moments and focus on the structure behind it. The first major gap is the marketing language versus reality. The retreat was presented as an immersive weekend experience with Meghan Markle at its center, not a short appearance, but a full emotional and personal engagement. The language used around the event suggested access, intimacy, and ongoing presence. In practice, the most talked about moment was a brief 2-hour segment. That disconnect is not minor. It is the core tension that defines the entire story.
Compare this to Pamela Anderson, who is doing a similar wellness-style event in Australia at a 2,500-seat theater with tickets starting at $85. She has already sold over 2,000 seats. Meghan cannot fill 300 at 10 times the price.
Second, the event sits clearly inside the celebrity economy model, where value is not measured in time or substance, but in proximity. People were not paying for activities alone. They were paying for presence, association, and symbolic access to a global figure. In that system, Meghan is not just a speaker. She is the product that gives the event its pricing structure. Once you understand that, the entire format becomes less about wellness and more about monetized visibility. Third, there is the repeated presence of the same social ecosystem. Figures like Marcus Anderson consistently appear around these environments, alongside networks linked to private member culture such as Soho House. This creates a pattern where the same inner circle moves between events, projects, and appearances. It gives the impression of a tightly connected world where access and relationships overlap across multiple layers of celebrity infrastructure. Fourth is the value breakdown that is impossible to ignore. Guests reportedly paid thousands of dollars for an experience structured around wellness programming, yet the headline attraction was limited to a short appearance window. The rest of the weekend continued without the central figure, which naturally reframes the entire purchase. From Weekend with Meghan to a scheduled appearance inside a larger retreat program. Fifth is the repetition of narrative framing. Across multiple public appearances, Meghan consistently returns to the same theme: long-term public scrutiny, emotional strain, and resilience under pressure. The repeated emphasis on being attacked over a decade becomes a defining thread of her public communication style. For some audiences, this builds consistency and identity. For others, it creates a perception of a fixed narrative that appears in every high-profile setting. Sixth is the split in interpretation. One side sees a standard celebrity engagement where expectations were misunderstood or exaggerated by marketing. The other side sees a pattern of overpromised exclusivity paired with highly controlled appearances. The same facts are interpreted in completely different ways depending on whether the focus is on branding or on attendee expectations. Finally, everything points back to a single underlying tension. What exactly was being sold? Not just access to a retreat, but access to a figure whose presence defines the entire experience. And once that presence becomes limited, structured, and time-restricted, the gap between perception and delivery becomes the central story. Not the retreat itself, but the way it was framed, priced, and experienced. And that's where this whole story really lands, somewhere between expectation, branding, and perception, with very different interpretations depending on who is watching. If you've made it this far, I'm curious what you think about all of this. Was this simply a misunderstood retreat format, or another example of celebrity marketing not matching reality? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. And if you want more breakdowns like this, covering the biggest royal stories, controversies, and behind-the-scenes narratives, make sure to subscribe to Crown Clash so you don't miss the next one. Check my channel for more video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.